The last week of October, Burlington, Vermont, and the sugar maples along Battery Street had gone the color of old copper. The auction house on Pine Street was doing its autumn estate sale, where old money families quietly unloaded the things they could no longer pretend to want. Callum Reed was in the loading bay behind the building, wrapping a Windsor chair in moving blankets. 8 months working restoration and transport for Aldrich Fine Estates. His hands still knew good joinery when they touched it. A woman's voice carried from the main floor through the propped fire door. Something about the writing desk being the wrong period for the catalog listing. Then she was walking past the bay on her way to the parking lot, already on her phone, a folder under her arm. She stopped when she saw the chair. She said, "Whoever bought that at the reserve price got the deal of the night." Callum set the blanket down. He said it before he thought about whether he should. "The deal of the decade. Your catalog had it listed as a reproduction. It is not." She looked at him. She looked at the chair. She said, "How long have you known that?" "Since the first time I moved it." She was quiet for a moment. Then she said almost to herself, "So did I." She walked to her car. Callum watched her go. He wrapped the chair and did not say anything else. "If this opening held you, drop the word stay in the comments before we go on." 6 in the morning. November now, and the light came in low over Lake Champlain and lay flat across the workshop floor. Callum was in early. The radiator clicked and the smell of linseed oil was in everything. His colleague Brent looked up from the workbench when he came in, poured a second mug without being asked, and slid it across. By 7 Callum was home. The kitchen of his rented farmhouse on Williston Road smelled of maple syrup and the particular staleness of a house where someone had made breakfast at 6 in the morning and then tried to be quiet about it. His daughter Nora was at the table in her school sweater, a library book open beside her cereal bowl, reading without appearing to read. She was 9. She had her mother's eyes and Callum's way of being still in a room. "You came back late," she said without looking up. "There was an estate sale." "Just the sale." She turned a page. Callum poured himself coffee and sat across from her. He watched her read. After a while she closed the book and put it in her backpack and said, "Dad." "Yes." "Is the lady from the auction house going to come back?" He set his mug down. "What lady?" "Brent told me you helped someone with a chair." "Brent talks too much." Nora zipped her bag and looked at him with the precise patience of a child who has learned to wait people out. He did not say anything more. She picked up her backpack and kissed his cheek and went to wait for the bus. On the 14th floor of the Whitmore Group's Burlington office, Genevieve Whitmore stood at the window with a coffee that was no longer warm. The lake below was the color of pewter. Her operations director, Peter Cass, knocked once and came in with a tablet and a face arranged carefully into neutral. "Drummond filed his motion this morning," he said. "Minority shareholder challenge. He wants a governance review before the December board vote." She nodded. "Genevieve." She did not turn. He set the tablet on her desk and left. She did not look at the tablet. She looked at the photograph on the bookshelf beside the window. Her father at the wheel of a restored 1923 sloop called Meridian. The summer she was 12, both of them squinting into the sun off the lake. He had taught her to sail that summer. He had also taught her that the difference between a reproduction and an original was in the weight of the thing in your hands, and that most people never picked it up long enough to know. At noon she drove to the auction house. No appointment. The loading bay door was open and Callum was at the workbench inside, sanding a rail joint on a drop-leaf table. She stopped 3 feet from the threshold. He felt the change in the light before he heard anything. He stood. "I want a full condition report on every piece coming through the November consignment," she said. "I want it before the catalog goes to print." "You will have it by Thursday." She nodded. She did not move. He waited. "Anything else, Miss Whitmore?" He looked at him. He looked at her. The loading bay around them held its ordinary sounds. A forklift somewhere in the warehouse, rain beginning on the metal roof, the low hum of the freight elevator. "No," she said, "that is all." She turned to go. He let her reach the door before he said it. "I should not have said what I said last night about the catalog." She stopped. She did not turn around. "You think I would have kept walking if you had not." She went out into the rain. He stood with the sandpaper in his hand and looked at the place she had been standing. Then he sat down on the edge of the workbench and put both hands flat on his knees. He was not hurt. He did not know what he was. That evening he stood outside the loading bay after the rest of the crew had gone and watched the rain move across the parking lot in sheets. Brent came up beside him with 2 paper cups of coffee from the machine in the break room and put one in his hand. "You wanted to say it," Brent said. "Not last night. There is not a right night for that kind of thing." They drank without talking until the rain let up enough to see the far end of the lot. The next morning, Genevieve stayed at her desk past her usual hour. She had a stack of contracts in front of her and she read none of them. She stood and walked to the bookshelf and lifted the photograph down and laid it flat on the desk, face up. The Meridian. Her father had spent 3 years restoring it himself in the barn behind the house in Shelburne, with a carpenter he had hired out of a boatyard in Maine. The carpenter had been 26. Her father had told her at the time that the man had turned down a better-paying job in Boston to finish the work correctly, and that this was the only qualification her father had ever needed from anyone. She had been 15. She had not thought about that in 20 years. Peter came in with the morning schedule. He glanced at the photograph on the desk. He glanced at her. "The new conservator," he said, as if it had occurred to him incidentally. "Callum Reed." I was looking at his file. He used to work in furniture conservation at the Shelburne Museum. She did not look up how long ago. About 12 years. He left to go home when his wife got sick. Peter did not add anything after that. He set the schedule on the desk and left. Genevieve waited until the door was closed. Then she put her hand on the photograph and held it there. By midday, she was at the auction house again. She walked past the main floor and found Callum in the back storage room, where they kept the uncatalogued estate pieces, the ones that needed assessment. The overhead light was on. He was crouched beside a steamer trunk, lifting the tray liner carefully with both hands. She did not wait for him to stand. "You worked at the Shelburne Museum," she said. He set the liner down. He stood slowly. "Yes." "You left to come home." "Yes. My father had a carpenter restore the Meridian the summer I was 12. He told me the man had turned down work in Boston to finish the job right." Callum was quiet for a moment. He said, "He told me the same thing in reverse, that the work was worth more than the offer." She sat down on the edge of a crate. She did not do it because she decided to. Her legs made the decision. She held herself very still. "You were going to stay on at the museum. You had a curatorial position." "I was going to." His wife's name was Beth. He did not say it yet. He said, "My wife got sick. We came back to Vermont because this was where she wanted to be. She had 14 months after we got home. After she died, I went into the studio and looked at my work table and knew I was going to hate the next piece I touched, so I did not touch one for almost 3 years. Genevieve was quiet. "Why did you come back to this work?" "Because Nora grew up going to the museum with me on Saturdays. Because the pieces in that storage room have not been looked at properly in years, and someone needs to. Because Brent needed a conservator, and I needed to put my hands on something, and there was no other answer I could live with." She nodded. She stood. She walked to the doorway and stopped with her hand on the frame. "He should have told me it was you," she said, "that summer. He understood why you were too young to need that information." "I know he did," she said. "He always decided what people were ready for." She left. Callum stood in the storage room under the overhead light and did not move for a long time. 2 floors up in a glass-walled office at the Drummond Capitol building on Church Street, Warren Drummond opened a locked credenza and took out a folder marked Whitmore Family Holdings, Confidential 2013. He looked at it. He put it back. He picked up his phone. "Move the timeline up," he said. 6 weeks is too long." Callum came home that evening and Nora was at the kitchen table again. She had drawn 2 chairs this time, the Windsor and another one beside it that was smaller, with a different leg style, which was accurate to nothing but was clearly intentional. "That one is wrong," he said. "The proportions." "I know," she said. "I was guessing." He kissed the top of her head and sat down. She colored in the seat of the smaller chair. "Dad." "Yes." "Tomorrow when you go in early." "Yes." "Is it because of her?" He set his fork down very carefully on the edge of his plate. "Hot tea. You do not have to tell me," Nora said. She finished the leg of the chair and started on the shadow beneath it. Callum watched her draw for a long time, and did not know what to do with the feeling of being understood by someone who still needed help reaching the high shelf in the bathroom. 3 days later, Genevieve sent a message through the company portal. It was 4 sentences. An estate in Woodstock had consigned a collection of early American pieces for private sale. She wanted a preliminary assessment before the consignment was formally accepted. Could he come to the office Thursday at 2? He came at 2. Her office was on the 14th floor, the lake filling the window. She closed the door and did not go to the desk. She took one of the 2 chairs by the window and gestured to the other. "I am not the right conservator for a private sale assessment," he said. "You have people more senior." "I know." "Then why am I here?" She set a folder on the table between them and did not open it. "This is not about the Woodstock consignment, Callum. This is me asking if you want to come back to serious work, cataloging, conservation direction. We are building a curatorial department." He looked at the lake. A ferry was making the crossing toward the New York shore. He had not said any of this out loud to anyone except Brent, and Brent had not asked questions for 8 months. At the end he said, "Beth was in a room I had painted the color of birch bark because she said she wanted to feel like she was inside the forest. I did not do any conservation work for those last 8 months. After she died, I went into my studio and looked at my table, and I knew if I touched the next piece I would hate it. So I did not touch one for nearly 3 years, and then I came here and I started again slowly. If I go back to the level of work you are describing, I will know whether I still have it, and I am not ready to know that yet." Genevieve sat with her hands flat on her knees. "Thank you for telling me," she said. She did not push. She did not lean forward. She looked at him with a steadiness that did not require anything in return. There was a knock. Peter opened the door before she answered. He said, "I am sorry, Nora's school tried to reach you. Your phone was off." Callum stood. Behind Peter in the reception area, Nora was standing beside the elevator in her school coat, her backpack on, holding a permission slip folded in half with both hands. Genevieve walked out before he did. She crossed the lobby and crouched down to Nora's eye level and held out her hand. "I am Genevieve," she said. "Your father has been taking very good care of some very old furniture for my family." Nora shook her hand. "I am Nora, I know, he told me about the chair." Callum heard the teacher say something about a missed pickup and an after-school program that had ended early. He heard it without processing it. He stood in the doorway and watched his daughter take a stranger's hand without checking with him first. The ice storm came in on a Thursday. The National Weather Service put Burlington under a freezing rain advisory by 4 in the afternoon. By 6, the roads were glazed, and the parking structure on St. Paul Street had closed its upper deck. The auction house had 12 pieces on loan for a weekend preview at a gallery on Church Street. All of them irreplaceable, none of them insured for transport in ice conditions. Genevieve called Brent at 6:15. Brent called Callum. Callum sent Nora to the neighbors and drove in. By 7 he was in the gallery loading bay with 2 other staff members, building padded crates from the materials in the van, working against the window of time before the roads became impassable. At 7:45 a set of headlights swung into the lot and stopped. Genevieve got out in a wool coat and work boots. She did not announce herself. She went directly to the longest piece, a 7-foot secretary desk in figured walnut, and began measuring the interior of the nearest crate with her handspan. She knew what she was doing. She knew the difference between quarter sawn and flat sawn, knew which joints were likely to be fragile, knew to slide rather than lift on the base molding. She had grown up in houses full of this furniture, and she had paid attention. She did not speak to Callum except to call out dimensions and ask for padding depth. He did not speak to her except to confirm. Once, carrying opposite ends of a blanket-wrapped lowboy through the narrow gallery doorway in the dark and the cold, they looked at each other across the length of it, and neither of them looked away for the count of 3. Then she called the next piece and they moved. By 11 the gallery was cleared. The pieces were secured in the warehouse. The small crew stood in the loading bay with instant coffee. Genevieve sat on an equipment case beside Callum. Her coat was damp at the shoulders. Her breath was still coming down from the work. Neither of them said anything about the lobby or the chair or the question she had asked that he had not answered. Neither of them needed to. When she fell asleep against the wall of the loading bay, Brent put his jacket over her shoulders. Callum watched him do it. Brent met his eyes once and went back to his coffee. By morning, the roads had cleared. That afternoon, the Vermont Business Weekly ran a small item online, 8 paragraphs, restrained language. It noted that the director of the Whitmore Group had been observed in what some described as an unusual degree of personal involvement with a junior member of the firm's estate services team, and that certain minority stakeholders were raising questions about professional judgment during a sensitive governance review. It did not name Callum. It cited an anonymous source close to the board. Genevieve read it in her car before she went up. She did not respond publicly. She called Callum from her desk at 3. "Did you see it?" "I saw it. If you want distance from this, I will not ask you to explain. I mean that." There was a silence long enough that she thought the call had dropped. "No," he said. "Genevieve," I said no. She closed her eyes. She held the phone and did not speak for a moment. "Thank you," she said. She ended the call. Across town, Warren Drummond read the article on his monitor and permitted himself a small, deliberate smile. He had waited 18 months for a moment like this. 4 days later, Callum submitted a revised consignment recommendation to the Whitmore Acquisitions Committee. Instead of the Woodstock collection, he proposed a full conservations assessment and private documentation project for a group of pieces already in the Whitmore family's own estate inventory. Pieces that had never been properly cataloged, pieces her father had spent the last decade of his life acquiring from private sources because he believed they were significant, the kind of work that required someone who understood what they were looking at. Genevieve approved it the same afternoon. Brent took Callum into the storage room and pulled back the canvas covers. The pieces had been sitting in climate-controlled darkness for 2 years. The surfaces were dull but intact. The construction was exactly what Callum had suspected when he first moved them. He ran his hand along the underside of a card table and felt the maker's mark pressed into the wood, faint but legible. He stood there for a long time with his hand on it. Nora came on a Saturday. She climbed onto a storage crate before he could help her up and sat with her legs hanging over the edge, looking at the pieces arranged in the light from the propped door. "Dad." "Yes." "Did you really know what these were?" "From the first time I touched them." "Who were they for before?" He told her about the man who had bought them quietly over 20 years, not for display, but because he thought someone ought to keep them together. Nora touched the edge of the card table. She did not ask another question. Genevieve arrived in the afternoon. She wore jeans and a flannel shirt, her hair back. She did not look like a company director. She climbed onto a second crate beside Nora without asking, and the two of them sat looking at the pieces in the late light. Nora said after a while, "You do not have a mom either, do you?" Genevieve was quiet. "How do you know that?" "Because you do not ask me about mine. People who have their moms always do." Genevieve looked at the card table for a moment. "My mom died when I was a little older than you." Nora's voice. "Do you still miss her?" "Every day, but the missing got quieter. I can hear other things now too." Nora nodded, the slow nod of a child receiving information she already half understood. "Me too," she said. Below the crate, Callum was documenting a joint on the far side of the table. He went still. He kept his hands where they were. At the end of the afternoon, Genevieve walked Nora to Callum's truck and stood beside her while Callum locked up. She did not say goodbye. She touched the top of Nora's head once, lightly, and walked to her own car. That evening, Warren Drummond was in the parking structure on Battery Street when Genevieve came down from a late meeting. He was standing at her car. His hands were in his overcoat pockets. "Vote with us, Genevieve. There are 6 board members ready to call a confidence review. Give us the December vote." "No." "Then there is something about your father's acquisition records I will put in front of the business press." She unlocked the car. "Warren, if there were anything irregular in my father's acquisition records, you would have used it a year ago. You have had 18 months. He smiled. "Not irregular, just interesting." He walked away across the deck. His footsteps echoed off the concrete. She stood beside her car with her hand on the door and did not get in for a long time. Monday morning, Brent asked Genevieve to come to the document archive in the basement of the auction house. He locked the door behind them. He opened the old fireproof cabinet in the corner and took out a legal envelope that had been filed there for 2 years. "Your father brought this to me 6 months before he died," Brent said. "He told me to give it to you when you could look at it without needing to put it down. I have waited 2 years. I decided I am done waiting. She opened it at the work table. 2 documents. The first was a copy of a trust instrument dated 2013, executed before 2 witnesses. It assigned 7% of her father's personal Whitmore Group holdings to a private trust, with voting rights held by a named trustee until 2031. The named trustee was Callum Reed. The second was a letter in her father's handwriting. 4 pages, the last one shorter than the others. He had written that he knew what the board would try to do after he was gone. He had written that he had chosen Callum because Callum had once told him, on a job that was nearly finished, that he had found a flaw in a structural joint that would not have been visible for 20 years, but that he was going to fix it before he left. He had not asked to be paid for the extra time. He had written that a man like that was the only kind of person he trusted to hold something he cared about. He had written that he did not tell Genevieve while he was alive because he did not want her to inherit a direction. He wanted her to find the answer on her own and trust it when she did. At the bottom of the last page he had written, "If you are reading this, Brent believed you were ready. He has not been wrong about a person in 30 years. She folded the letter. She put both documents back in the envelope. She looked at Brent. "Drummond knew," she said. "He was the executor's outside counsel. He was supposed to notify Callum when the trust became active. He never did." She nodded once. She left the archive with the envelope under her arm. She drove out of the lot and north on Route 7, and through Shelburne to the cemetery on the hill above the village, where the old maples stood close together and dropped their leaves in a slow, steady way through November. She parked. She walked up the hill to her father's stone and sat down on the grass beside it. She did not say much. "You should have let me know him sooner." The wind moved in the maples. A crow called from somewhere in the tree line and was not answered. She stayed for an hour. She did not hear Callum until he was already sitting down on the other side of the stone. He did not look surprised. She did not look surprised. "You come here," she said. "Once a month," he said. "Since the fall he died, he had good coffee taste. We used to talk about wood." She almost smiled. "How long today?" "I just got here." She nodded. They sat on either side of the stone and looked down the hill toward the lake, which was visible between the trees as a strip of pale gray. After a while, Callum said, "He did not tell you because he believed that people only trust the things they find themselves. You could have been told at 35 and walked past it. He needed you to arrive here on your own." She was quiet. "You knew him in one way that I did not. I knew him in one way that you did not." "Yes," she said. The sun dropped lower behind the tree line. A car door closed somewhere below on the road. Neither of them stood. When the light began to go, they rose at the same moment. They walked down the hill along the gravel path without speaking. At the bottom, they went to cars. She lifted her hand from the steering wheel as she pulled past him. He raised his. That night, Callum sat beside Nora's bed after she had fallen asleep. The room was quiet. The window was cracked, and he could hear the wind in the maple at the corner of the house. He had not spoken to Beth in his head in a long time. It had stopped being a thing he could do, and then, sometime in the past few weeks, it had come back differently. He did not ask for permission. He said, "I think I am going to touch the hard work again," and then he said, "I think it is going to be all right." He sat there another half hour. Then he went to the kitchen and made tea and stayed up until the sky outside went from black to the specific gray that comes before first light. He was at the auction house by 6. Brent was already there. "I will take the trustee position," Callum said. Brent looked at him over his mug. "For the 7%. For the 240 years this collection has been intact, because she should not have to stand there alone. Not for her." "That too," Brent said, "but not only." He held out his hand. Callum took it. By the following Tuesday, Genevieve had the trust voting documents executed. She and Callum sat at the conference table in her office with a list of 9 shareholders. 5 were persuadable. They had 4 days before the December board meeting. They spent those 4 days in back-to-back conversations. Genevieve brought the valuation analysis. Callum brought the conservation vision he had not let himself describe aloud in years. A private curatorial department producing authenticated documentation for the Whitmore collection, a consulting practice for other estate families in the region, existing positions preserved, 7 new ones created over the next 3 years. He spoke about the work the way he had spoken about it when he was 26, and had believed without question that it mattered. By Thursday evening they had firm commitments from 4 of the 5. One was still uncertain. Thursday night Nora was asleep on the office sofa under Genevieve's coat. Callum had brought her because school was closed for a teacher development day, and the neighbors were in Montreal. Genevieve had laid the coat over her sometime around 9 without a word. At 10:30 Genevieve stood up from the table to stretch. Callum stood at the same time. They ended up on the same side of the table in the low light with Nora asleep 10 feet away. He reached up and moved a strand of hair from her face. He stopped with his hand still near her cheek. She did not move, neither of them did. He could have. She could have. Neither did. Genevieve said quietly, "Not yet." "I know." He stepped back. She stepped back. He sat on the far side of the table. She sat across from him. They did not speak for a minute. Then they went back to the list. It was the closest either of them had come to choosing what was easy over what was right. They had chosen right. Both of them knew it, and neither said so. Late that night, after Callum had carried Nora to the elevator and Genevieve had locked the office, she sat at her desk and opened her laptop. Her attorney had forwarded an email that afternoon, sourced from the executor's records during discovery. It was from Warren Drummond to the estate's outside counsel, dated 5 months after her father's death. It read, "Do not contact the designated trustee until I have authorized it. Authorization may not come." She read it twice. She forwarded it to her attorney with one line, "File this Friday morning before 10. She closed the laptop. Friday morning. The 15th floor conference room of the Whitmore Group. 9 shareholders around the table, the board along the wall, Warren Drummond at the head. He opened with the Drummond Capital proposal. A governance restructuring and partial equity buyout. The numbers were favorable on paper. Near the end of his presentation he put up a slide that referenced, without naming directly, the newspaper item from the previous week. He let it sit on the screen 4 seconds longer than necessary. Genevieve stood. She was not loud. She walked to the front of the room and set 3 documents on the table. She read the trust instrument aloud. Her voice did not change register. She read her father's letter aloud. It was 4 pages and she did not skip a line. Then she put the 3rd document on the table and read the email from Warren Drummond to outside counsel, instructing them to suppress notification of the named trustee. The date at the top of the email was 5 months after her father's burial. The room held its breath. An older shareholder named Francis Webb, white-haired, a friend of her father's since before Genevieve was born, leaned forward. "Warren," she said, "tell me I am misreading this." Drummond did not say anything. Francis looked at the table for a long moment. She sat back. Callum stood from his chair at the far end of the room. He did not raise his voice. He did not lead with anger. He laid out the plan that he and Genevieve had built over 4 days. The collection intact, the curatorial department opened. The consulting practice generating revenue within 3 years. 240 years of documented acquisitions preserved and finally made accessible. 7 new positions over 36 months. He spoke for 11 minutes. He spoke about objects and time, and the specific kind of care that cannot be manufactured by a company that does not understand what it is holding. He finished by saying, "Arthur Whitmore trusted me not to let this be reduced to a line item. I am not going to let it be. His daughter should not have to defend that alone. That is everything I have." He sat down. The vote was taken by share percentage. Genevieve's 34, Callum's 7 in trust, Francis Webb's 11. 3 more shareholders went with them. The total against Drummond's motion came to 61%. The motion failed. Francis made the second motion to remove Warren Drummond from the board immediately, pending civil action for breach of fiduciary duty in the administration of the Whitmore estate. The vote was unanimous except for Drummond's own shares. Drummond gathered his papers. He did not look at anyone. He walked to the elevator and stood waiting for it. A journalist from the Burlington Free Press had already left a voicemail on his cell. He did not listen to it. The doors opened. He stepped in. He had spent 22 years building a position in this company. He could not think, standing in that elevator with the doors closing, of a single sentence that would have changed what had just happened. He could not think of what he had missed or when. The doors closed. In the conference room, Genevieve thanked the shareholders. Francis came to her and put both hands on her arms and said, Your father would have known exactly what to make of this morning, and he would have been very proud of how you handled it." Genevieve said, "Thank you. He would have liked hearing you say that." When the room had emptied, it was just the two of them at the long table. Outside the window, the lake was full of late morning light. She said, "We should get out of this room." Stood. "Yes." They walked out together. That evening they had dinner at Callum's house on Williston Road. Genevieve brought a pie she had made that afternoon in her own kitchens between calls with her attorney. The filling had gone slightly too sweet because she had been on the phone when she added the sugar and had lost count. Nora ate 2 slices and said nothing critical. The kitchen smelled of cinnamon and the particular cold air that came through the window above the sink when the temperature dropped after dark. Nora talked about school. The 3rd grade had started a project on Lake Champlain ecology, and the teacher had asked them to find out which fish species were native. Genevieve named 4 of them, including the lake trout and the walleye, and explained how to tell them apart by the shape of the tail, which her father had taught her when she was Nora's age. Nora looked at her with a long considering silence, which was the highest form of approval she gave. After the dishes, Nora went to brush her teeth. She did not wait to be told. Callum stood with a dish towel in his hand and watched her go down the hall. Genevieve said, "What?" "She used to need reminding," he said. "Tonight she just went." "How long since she stopped needing it?" "Tonight is the first time." Genevieve did not say anything to that. She took the dish towel from his hand and started drying. After Nora was in bed, they went out to the back porch. The yard was dark. The nearest neighbor's lights were on across the field. They stood at the railing without speaking. At the gala, Genevieve said, "I did not plan what I said about the chair. I did not know I believed it until I had already said it." Callum kept looking at the field. "I had been thinking it for 6 months," he said. "Every time you walk through the loading bay, I did not say it once." "Why not?" "I did not think it was mine to say." She turned to look at him. "It was always yours." He turned then. The porch light was low. Her face was in half shadow. He reached out, and she reached at the same moment, and their hands found each other. Not fingertips, the whole hand. Neither of them held on tightly. They just held. They did not kiss. They stood on the back porch of the rented farmhouse on Williston Road and held hands in the dark and the cold coming off the field, and did not need anything more than that for one night. After a while she said, "I should head back." "All right." "I will be here Saturday." "All right." She walked down the porch steps. She did not look back, but she lifted her hand without turning. When she reached the bottom, he stood at the screen door and watched until her taillights had gone past the bend in the road, and the sound of the engine had become part of the general quiet of the field. Inside, kitchen light was on. He turned it off. He stood in the dark with his hand on the switch for a moment. He could hear Nora breathing in the back bedroom. He could hear the wind in the maple at the corner of the house. He had not known 3 years ago that there was a version of his life waiting on the other side of the one he was living. He had not let himself look for it. Tonight he could see it. He went to bed. 7 weeks later, on a Saturday in mid-January, Burlington was in a cold spell, bright and still, the lake frozen out to the sandbar. Warren Drummond had resigned from the board in December. The civil case was in discovery. The curatorial department of the Whitmore Group was scheduled to open in March under Callum Reed 4 days a week, with a standing arrangement about school pickup on Fridays. Nora had started a junior docent program at the Shelburne Museum on alternate Saturdays. Genevieve had found it online and sent him the link without adding a message. That morning, the Whitmore family collection was formally cataloged and moved to proper archival storage. It was not a public event. Callum, Brent, Genevieve, and Nora were there, and 2 members of the conservation staff. Callum asked Nora if she wanted to do the final entry in the condition log for the card table, the first piece assessed, and the one she had sat beside on the afternoon in October. She sat down on the floor next to it with the log open on her knee. She wrote her entry in careful small letters in the space for conservator notes. She wrote, "Nora was here, October to January. The wood is fine." Callum looked at it. He did not change a word. He countersigned it and dated it and closed the log. They carried the table to its place in the archive. The rest of the pieces followed. When everything was in and the doors were closed and the light above the archive entrance was green, they stood in the hallway, and Brent opened a thermos of coffee and poured 4 cups, and there was a moment where nobody said anything, because nothing needed to be said. Later that afternoon, on loan from a private collection for the opening documentation project, a 1924 slant-top desk arrived in the loading bay. Callum assessed it while Nora sat on a crate and watched. Genevieve stood beside him. He ran his hand along the underside of the case and found the maker's marks as the card table, same shop, same decade. They were made for the same house, he said. He had not said anything like that out loud in years, not with that certainty, not without checking himself first. Genevieve said, "I know. I have been waiting for someone to find that." He looked at her across the desk. She looked back. Nora, watching from the crate, looked at the desk, and then at both of them, and then back at the desk, with the focused attention of someone who understands that certain things are being confirmed that she has known for some time. She said, "Dad." "Yes." "Is Genevieve going to keep working here?" Callum kept his hand on the desk. He looked at the maker's mark, small and clean in the wood. "I was hoping she would," he said. Genevieve was looking at the window. The light outside was going. She did not turn her head. She was already smiling the way a person smiles when they have been patient for a long time, and the thing they were patient for has finally simply arrived. "I will," she said. Nora nodded once and went back to the desk. The loading bay was warm. Outside, the lake was still frozen and the light was almost gone. The pieces were catalogued. The work was beginning. Callum kept his hand on the wood and did not move for a moment, not because he needed to, but because for the first time in a long time he was exactly where he had meant to be. There is a moment in this story that I keep coming back to. Callum standing in a storage room with his hand flat on a piece of furniture, knowing exactly what it was and saying nothing for months, not because he was hiding it, because the person who needed to know it had to arrive there herself. That kind of patience is not passive. It is one of the hardest things a person can practice. I think about what Callum did when he found the flaw in the joint on Arthur Whitmore's boat, years before any of this. He fixed it without being asked and without adding it to his invoice. Nobody would have known. The piece would have held for another decade before it failed. But he knew, and that was enough for him to act. That is the kind of integrity that does not perform itself. It just does the work and goes home. And I think that single decision, made quietly in a boatyard when Callum was 26 years old, was the reason everything else in this story was eventually possible. Cause and effect are almost never obvious in the moment. They show up years later, in forms you did not expect. Genevieve spent years running a company she had inherited at the wrong time, surrounded by people who were always calculating the angle. Warren Drummond was smart. He was organized. He had positioned himself carefully for nearly 2 decades. But he built everything on the assumption that other people were doing the same thing he was doing, measuring, maneuvering, waiting for the right moment to play a card. He could not account for Callum because Callum was not playing that game, and he could not account for Genevieve because she had learned, from a father who fixed things quietly and trusted people who did the same, to recognize the real thing when she was standing in front of it. What I find most true about this story is not the romance. It is the question of what gets you through the years that break you. Callum lost his wife. He lost his work. He lost the version of himself that knew how to walk into a studio and begin. He did not recover quickly. He did not recover cleanly. He spent 3 years not touching the thing he loved because he was not ready to find out whether it was still there. That is not weakness. That is honesty. And eventually, because he stayed honest with himself about it, he found his way back. Not by forcing it, by waiting until the conditions were right and then choosing, on a night when the roads were iced and there was real work to be done, to simply show up and be useful. Nora knew before either of them did. Children often do. They have not yet learned to talk themselves out of what they can plainly see. She drew 2 chairs beside each other in October and did not explain why. She wrote her name in the condition log in January with the same quiet certainty. She was not waiting for permission to believe that her life was going to be good. She was already living as if it was. I think the 3 of them, the man who fixed things no one else noticed, the woman who learned to recognize what was real, and the girl who drew the smaller chair without being asked, got to where they ended up because each of them in their own way chose honesty over convenience, patience over speed, and the hard right thing over the easy available one. That combination does not always get rewarded on a schedule you would choose. But in my experience, it tends to hold.